There was a game that you may have seen in some YouTube videos or in social media or in some malls that challenged the player by placing a huge gold bar worth about $1,500 inside a transparent box. And on one side of that box, there was a little hole that barely fit the gold bar. And the player's job was to use his or her hand to take the gold bar out from that box through that little hole. But because the hole was just barely enough to fit the gold bar, so plus your hand, you won't be able to pull the whole thing out. And that was the rule of the game. Unless the player is willing to release the gold bar inside that box, then the player could pull his hand out, but empty. I think that game has a moral lesson for all of us because it took advantage of our greed. We always want something more. We always want something free. We always want something that doesn't even belong to us. And it is super hard and even painful for us to let it go. But a gold bar is somehow still something good for us to hold on to, right? Because it's valuable, $1,400. But what if we replace that gold bar with something that we know is sinful, something that we know is bad, like our prejudice against somebody, like our laziness for our duties, our lustful desire towards somebody, our ignorance of morality, or our greed to acquire things that don't belong to us. All of those things, in theory, we all know from our conscience that those things are bad. But we still hold on to them with a very firm grip. We are not willing to let them go, even though they will bring us the feeling of guilt and of shame. That is why we still have to go to confession for the same sins over and over again, because we're still holding on to those sins and temptations. We couldn't let them go. Now, Jesus told us in the gospel today to be courageous and decisive, to cut off all the sinful temptations that we are holding on to in our life. It takes great courage and even great sacrifice to let things go, especially things that bring us pleasure and joy in this world. But Jesus once again reminds us that true joy could only be found when we are willing to give up sins and temptations from this world, because the devil took advantage of those pleasure and joy to make us sin. So the first thing I'd like to share with you today is that sins and temptations are often well disguised under pleasure, joy, comfort, and wealth in this world. So let us be courageous and decisive in giving them up. Giving them up in order to gain genuine joy and peace that Jesus offers. And in the second reading, we heard St. James emphasize that idea once more of giving up earthly wealth and benefits and attachment when he talked about greed of those who are rich. They would rather let their richness, their gold and silver, corrode it, rather than use them to help those in need. And they even use their wealth and their influence to harm others, to harm those who are righteous and who are doing good things. Now, the reality of the gap between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the voiceless in the society, reminds us once again about our responsibility. Our responsibility in a personal level to make good use of what God is giving us, that nothing would be wasted for no purpose. Because we notice that what we have extra may be what others people want but they don't get. So the second thing I'd like to share with you today is that the excess, the extra of what we have may be the needs of many others. Let us not waste what God has given us, but instead use them wisely to benefit one another. And in the first reading from the book of Numbers, we heard the story from 3,000 years ago, from the time of Moses. People didn't want to accept someone outside of their group, even though they all spoke the truth about God. They didn't want to accept. And in the gospel, 1,000 years after Moses, the same situation, the same mentality is still present. While the disciples of Jesus trying to tell Jesus to stop those who are not in their group to do good work. Now, in both cases, we see that people use God's name in order to exclude and not to welcome people. They make themselves special and privileged, and they don't want any people or any other group to compete with them. I don't think I have to mention politics or anything like that. Those who don't say the same thing with us is against us. But our Catholic Church today is different from the Catholic Church just 50 years ago. Those who are in the church 50 years ago, you may notice that the church says 50 years ago that there's no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. You have to believe in Jesus. You have to be baptized. You have to follow Jesus in order to have salvation. That's why there's a situation where many missionaries, many Catholics trying to force non-Catholics to convert into the Catholic faith, because we believed back in the days that there's no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. But our church today has a more open mindset. Just a few weeks ago, when Pope Francis was having a tour in Southeast Asia, he was in Singapore, and in an interreligious meeting, he said, all religions are paths to the one God. We cannot say my God is better than your God, because there's only one God, and that God is for everyone. Of course, we know that Catholics, we are in the expressway to God, and the other religions have to join us, but we don't force people to believe. We give them the choice. And we do missionary work not by converting them by word, but by our own actions. They look at us, they see that we are living good life, they see that we are giving good examples, they follow us. That is our way today. So brothers and sisters, just 3 points for us to reflect together on this Sunday. First, sins and temptations are often very well disguised under pleasure, joy, comfort, and wealth in this world. Let us therefore be courageous and decisive to give them up, to cut them off, in order to gain genuine joy and peace that Jesus offers. Second, the excess, the extra of what we have may be the needs of many, many others. Let us not waste what God has given us, but instead use them wisely to benefit one another. And third, we often make ourselves so special and privileged by excluding other people. But Jesus tells us today to focus on the positive aspects and welcome one another with an open arms and with the spirit of truth. Do not use God's name to create division. Use God's name to create a peaceful environment, to create love instead. So, be courageous in giving up sins and temptations to gain genuine joy and peace. Do not waste what God has given us, but use them instead to benefit those in need. And do not use God's name to create division, but to welcome one another in the one truth. May God, who has begun the good work in us, also bring it to fruitful completion. Amen.